So I am working on a wallet, so I figured it's a good time to let's talk about a little bit of carving. Um, Important things to do good carving. One, good quality piece of leather. Herman Oak, Wickett, and Craig. Depends what you prefer on various leathers. This one is actually, I think, Sapici is how it's pronounced. It's a European or Italian, I think, company. But anyway, those are all good brands. Those are all good leathers. The better the piece of leather, sometimes the better results you're going to get. And it's definitely going to make your life easier. Another thing, I've taken this piece of leather and I've, in order to keep it from stretching out of shape, I've put packing tape on the back of it. Real simple, real cheap, keeps it stretching out of shape and distorting the piece of leather so it's going to fit where you want it whenever you're going to put the piece together. It also will prevent things like you having a kind of a bubble in your carvings, in your leather after you carve it. Very important with stamping too. Now then, this has been wet down, and I wet it down, let it sit for a while, trace the pattern on, wet it down again. I want to get that water down deep in the leather, into the fibers under the surface. You don't want the surface really wet, you want those fibers underneath to be wet. And actually then let it sit again so it dries further down in. But you can start cutting with your swivel knife while you're waiting for that to dry in, soak in. That brings me to another point. The swivel knife, I've heard people, sometimes people that aren't even very good at carving say, oh, it doesn't need to be that sharp. Yes, it does. Your swivel knife should be as sharp as any other knife, and you should take a strop to it and polish it until that edge is basically a mirror. The less scratches, the finer the polish on this edge, the less drag you're going to have as you pull it through the leather. So, good leather crafters, and I know some really good carvers, they'll have a strop there with them, and they might stop mid-cut and say, nah, it needs to be stropped, and strop it some more. So, don't worry about that. Get it sharp, get it stropped, get it polished, and you'll have less drag, and that means you'll have more control over your cuts. Because there's a lot of people will say there's certain ways to use the swivel knife, certain ways to hold it. Yeah, take their advice, try that. But if it doesn't work for you as well as something else, don't do that. I was always told don't push your knife. You gotta pull it. And sometimes on carvings, I find it easier to turn around and push that knife. Just whatever happens to work. I also do a lot of the movements kind of more with my arm, moving my whole arm, than just sitting with my wrist. That's just something you learn over time that keeps you from wearing out as fast. Especially on these nice long cuts, you can just pull it right on down, move your arm, and just turn your hand a little bit. And just turn the barrel of the swivel knife to direct it where you want it to go. Of course, you only want to cut about halfway through whatever piece of leather you're working on. So we're not cutting super deep here. Might be a little too deep in some spots. Some people will say, you know you're carving deep enough if you can see the outline of the pattern on the back after you've stamped it, after you've gone through and beveled the lines and so on. That again depends. I would like to point out that on this one, even the spots I haven't cut yet, I'm already starting to see it through onto the back. So, that may or may not be a good guide. And that was just from the stylus point, transferring the pattern on. Another thing that shows this is going to be a good quality piece of leather, that it really compresses well all the way through. And like everything, nobody's good at this on day one, so practice, practice, practice. I like to stick to the same idea that you do with the beveling when I'm doing my cutting, and that's foremost first. So things that are in front, like this flower, I like to cut first. Mostly because if I wind up off my line a little bit, I can just kind of adjust, and then I just adjust the other pieces to match. If I've already got a line cut here from here, one of these pieces, and I go a little wide, then I've got a problem. But if I've got this line cut first, and then I can just make that one, and as long as I don't go over the lines, I should be good. Meaning, yeah, you could still make a mistake, but it's easier to cover them up if you're doing it foremost first. I feel like my points are starting to drag a little bit, so we're going to go ahead and strop this. Strops don't have to be anything magical. Just get yourself some jeweler's rouge, some white rouge, put it on a scrap of leather, put to a board, put it on a back of a business card or piece of cardstock, or cut a chunk out of a cereal box. It doesn't matter. Just as long as it polishes that edge, and that polishing compound is what does that job. And as long as it stays pretty flat, like I said, nothing special about it. And you can get polishing compound pretty much any hardware store. It's really common. Another thing that I've heard people say isn't important, that I think really is the order you use the tools in. Generally, it's parashade, bevel, camouflage, veiner. Those two can be switched. You can camouflage and vein in different orders. But there's reasons for this. You want to do your parashading before your beveling, so that your beveling can kind of, if you get a little wild with the parashading, you can kind of push it back up into place and push the leather back where it needs to be. And you want to do your beveling before you do your camouflaging or your veining. Just to keep everything out of the way of the camouflaging and veining. Now, backgrounding, seating, these can all be kind of done anytime after that. And your decorative cuts can be sort of done anytime after that. They don't really get in each other's way. But again, you want your beveling done before you do your backgrounding. And like I said, you want your parashading done before you do your beveling. So you've got a certain order. And like I said, generally that is parashade, bevel, camouflage, veiner. Then you can go to other texture tools if you want to use them, like mule's foot and cedars and so on, and get all that texture in. And then kind of your last two things are your backgrounding and decorative cuts. Having a little sandbag like this is also very useful to hold something in place while you're doing this, so it doesn't slide around on the table very much. Helps keep your tools moving the way that they're supposed to. And all this is a piece of leather, veg stand leather, with sand inside of it. I've heard them called carving weights, but I prefer the term that somebody in my leather guild used. He called them turtles. You will also hear people make a big deal about right and wrong ways to use tools and how to walk them around. And again, it's whatever works for you is probably what's best for you to do. You can try all those things. See if they work for you. But they don't always. So all I can do is say, this is what I do. You can do whatever works for you. But one thing is with like parashading, you'll generally want to have a focus, and your parashading all goes to that focus point. You'll do the same thing with your decorative cuts later. You'll try and have them all aim at that focus point. Usually on a flower like this, it'll be right where the stem meets the flower, or even the idea is that it's supposed to all flow towards and down the stem. So all these pieces and everything should follow the lines, but then flow towards a point down here. And it should all turn and go down to that point as you're going along. So that's something to keep in mind if you don't know which exact way you want to do things. Try and remember that everything should kind of flow, especially in this style pattern. Everything flows sort of like a river, downstream to down here. Now, on the subject of people saying right and wrong ways to use tools, one of these things is a technique that many beginners have trouble with, and it's walking a tool. And I've heard a lot of expert advice from people about how to move the tool and how to put pressure on a certain way or angle it exactly right. And yeah, some of that might help. Again, depends on the person, what you're doing. I learned to do this when I was a kid, and I've just always been able to do it, so it took me a long time to figure out what I was doing differently that made me able to walk a tool when other people couldn't. And it seems to be that when you're a kid, you don't have a lot of hand strength. You don't hold on to things very tight. And so I naturally never picked up the habit of holding the beveler very tight. It's basically just sitting in my fingers and can easily pull out. It's just enough that it doesn't fall out. I'll even have it slip a little bit and have to readjust every now and then if I'm just holding it. So that seems to be what works well for me, is to just hold the tool very loosely, and when I hit it, it kind of wants to bounce, and it kind of wants to follow the line as it bounces. And I just have to have enough grip on it, on this knurling, to turn the tool so that the edge of that beveler is following the line. Otherwise, it'll wander off across the leather. So I'm pretty much just steering it around as I hit it. Pretty much, I think that is what works for me, is to just hold the tools lightly. Don't death grip the tools. Seems to help, and also, it means I can bevel a lot longer without my hand cramping up. Pull you in a little closer for one here. So, this is one of the spots that I think it's very important to pay attention to. So this beveler doesn't get real tight into that corner because of its square shape without hitting this other part of the flower. Like it does over on this side, you can get in there and squish that down pretty good. In that corner. And that looks really good. Whereas this side, up here, this doesn't look very good because you've got that kind of corner that just sort of looks like it just part of this flower is part of the background. And I think it's very important to get into those spots. Like that. You can see it better from this angle. That spot right in there. To get in there with a pointed beveler, like this one. And push that down. And then you'll get a lot more depth, appearance of depth, I should say, out of your carving. That makes a big difference. You wouldn't think it would, but for some reason, the way the brain interprets images that you see, it'll see that as being the same level, and it basically, you lose a layer of your carving if you don't get in all those little points and corners. On this pattern, same thing right here. You want to get into that one with a pointed beveler. And in little corners like these, like right there, like right there, get in all those with the pointed bevelers. And like I said, I think you'll notice that you get a lot better carving that way, or at least a lot better appearing carving that way. And I'm just gonna go ahead and turn the camera off and plug away at this. I'll come back to y'all when I've got it. It might be when it's done. When I've got everything actually pushed in. But that's a few carving tips that you can use to make your carving look a little bit better. Alright, kind of one last little thing is when you're practicing, and like I said, practice, it's to be mindful and to think about what you could have done better as you're going. And I've noticed something that I need to work on this particular one. Something I kind of knew, but should have done better. And it's illustrated in two cuts, right here and right here. In this cut, I tapered out the cut like I'm supposed to. Did a really good job of tapering it out. In this cut, it just kind of ended right about here. Now, when I went to bevel these, this one kind of just has this edge to it. Whereas this one, when I beveled it out, you can see that the leather sort of pulled down where it was tapered off and gives it a really natural end to that, where that leather just kind of all of a sudden blends in. Whereas over here, I gotta go back and kind of fix it up with the modeling tool a little bit. Just to make it look like it matches a little bit better. But if I would have done my cut right to start with, these would look a little bit more natural right off from the carving. So that's something I need to work on my own carving. But try to look for things like that in your carving that you could have done better, and try to do better next time. And just, like I said, keep practicing.